Next week's episodes of EastEnders are set to deliver an emotional goodbye as Walford says their final farewell to Nigel Bates. And it sounds like viewers should prepare themselves for some seriously moving scenes between Phil Mitchell and Julie Hay. After weeks of concern surrounding Nigel's health and heartbreaking final storyline, the funeral episode promises to bring together some of Walford's most loved characters for one last goodbye. But because this is EastEnders, the day doesn't exactly go smoothly. As the square wakes on the morning of Nigel's funeral, emotions are already running high. Grant becomes increasingly worried about Mark, who appears to have gone missing, and he's seen desperately leaving another voicemail as panic begins to set in. Things quickly become even more tense when Vicky approaches Phil and Grant, looking for answers, believing Mark may be with them, only for the brothers to realize nobody knows where he actually is. And in true Mitchell fashion, family drama is never far away. Grant soon receives a threatening phone call from Russell, who demands full payment, instantly piling more pressure onto an already emotional day. The situation escalates further when Russell overhears Sam Mitchell nearby someone he clearly still has unfinished business with. Despite the tension building around them, Phil is determined not to let the chaos overshadow Nigel's funeral. Wanting the day to remain focused on his old friend, Phil insists they deal with Russell later, and for once, the Mitchell siblings reluctantly agree to have a united front. Before the funeral even begins, Phil, Grant, Sam and Billy decide they can't wait any longer and head off to find Mark immediately. Their search soon leads to a tense confrontation that threatens to completely derail the day before the family eventually returns to Albert Square. While there's plenty of classic Mitchell drama on the cards, it's the emotional moments surrounding Nigel's farewell that are expected to hit viewers the hardest. Nigel has been a huge part of EastEnders history ever since he first appeared back in the 1990s. Known for his warmth, humor, and loyalty, he quickly became one of Walford's most lovable characters and formed a particularly close bond with Phil Mitchell over the years. That friendship has been at the center of Nigel's recent storyline, with Phil stepping up to support him through some incredibly difficult moments. Seeing Phil vulnerable and emotional is something viewers rarely get, but it really pulls on the heartstrings. At the church, Nigel's loved ones gather to say their final goodbyes in what promises to be an emotional tribute filled with memories, heartbreak, and reflection. Julie, who struggles with writing Nigel's eulogy beforehand, leans on those closest to her for support. Thankfully, a shared memory helps her finally find the words she's been searching for. Given Nigel's long history in Walford, the funeral is likely to feel especially nostalgic for longtime viewers, with many fans already bracing themselves for tears. Later, after the service, Phil and Julie share what's being described as a heartfelt and deeply emotional moment together. With Phil carrying the weight of grief while trying to hold the family together, and Julie facing life without Nigel. But perhaps the biggest emotional moment of all comes right at the end, when Julie finally opens Nigel's letter. What's written inside remains a mystery for now, but if recent episodes are anything to go by, viewers should probably keep the tissues nearby. The square had seen heartbreak before, but nothing prepared Walford for the quiet sadness hanging in the air as Nigel Bates prepared to say goodbye once again. The news had spread quickly through Albert Square. Nigel was leaving. This time, it wasn't one of his usual short disappearances or hopeful promises that he'd return in a few weeks with another terrible joke and an even worse jumper. This goodbye felt final and everyone knew it. Outside the cafe, Phil Mitchell stood alone staring across the square. The tough hardman who had survived prison, betrayals, shootings, and countless family wars suddenly looked older than ever. He held a cup of tea that had long gone cold, but he barely noticed. Julie stepped out beside him quietly. "You gonna talk to him?" she asked gently. Phil shrugged. "What's there to say?" Julie gave him a look. "You know exactly what to say. You're just scared of saying it." Phil scoffed, though there was no real anger behind it. "I ain't scared of nothing." Julie smiled sadly. "That's always been your problem." Across the square, Nigel was loading boxes into a taxi. He moved slower than before, his cheerful grin fading every few seconds as reality hit him. Walford had always been home, even during the years he stayed away. Leaving again felt like tearing out a piece of himself. Inside the Vic, Linda watched from the window. "It's strange without him already," she admitted. Sharon nodded. "Nigel's one of the good ones. Walford doesn't have enough of them anymore." Meanwhile, Phil still hadn't moved. Julie folded her arms. You know he's waiting for you. Phil finally looked at her. I don't do emotional speeches. No, Julie replied softly, that hit harder but Nigel than Phil expected. For years, Nigel had been the one person who could crack Phil's armor without starting a fight. Back in the day when Phil's world collapsed around him, Nigel somehow found ways to make him laugh. Sometimes it annoyed Phil. Sometimes it saved him. And now he was leaving. Again. Phil finally muttered, Fine. Julie smiled warmly. About time. As Phil crossed the square, several residents noticed immediately. Conversations slowed. Even Ian Beale stopped talking for once. Nigel looked up from the taxi and froze. Phil, he said quietly. Phil shoved his hands into his pockets awkwardly. Heard you were sneaking off. Nigel laughed softly. Didn't think you cared. Don't push it. But the usual sharp edge in Phil's voice was missing. For a moment neither man spoke. Then Nigel smiled sadly. Funny, innit? Feels like yesterday we were causing chaos round here. Phil snorted. Mostly you causing chaos. That's not true, Nigel replied proudly. You helped occasionally. Phil shook his head, but a small smile appeared. Julie watched from nearby, emotional already. Nigel glanced around the square. I'm gonna miss this place. You hate this place, Phil replied. Yeah, Nigel admitted. But it's home. The word lingered between them. Phil looked down briefly before speaking again. You were always too good for Walford. Nigel blinked in surprise. That might be the nicest thing you've ever said to me. Don't get used to it. Nigel chuckled, but emotion was building in his eyes now. I mean it, Phil, he said quietly. You lot became my family. Phil looked uncomfortable instantly. Right. No, listen, Nigel continued. There were times I had nothing. No direction. No confidence. But this square gave me people who cared. And you, he paused. You were my best mate. Phil's expression cracked slightly. The silence became heavy. Finally, Phil muttered, You ain't so bad yourself. Julie covered her mouth. Stunned Phil had managed something heartfelt at all. Nigel laughed through watery eyes. Blimey. Someone write that down. Phil stepped closer. Look, I'm no good at this stuff. Obviously. But things change. People leave. Sometimes you don't get to say what matters before it's too late. Nigel listened carefully. Phil swallowed hard. So I'm saying it now. The square had gone almost silent around them. You mattered round here, Nigel, Phil said. More than you realize. Nigel's eyes filled instantly. And you mattered to me. Julie began crying softly nearby while Sharon looked equally emotional outside the Vic. Nigel suddenly pulled Phil into a hug. At first Phil froze completely, clearly horrified by public affection. But after a second he hugged him back. It wasn't just a goodbye between friends. It was years of history, mistakes, laughter, loyalty, and love wrapped into one moment. When they finally pulled apart, Phil cleared his throat aggressively. Right, that's enough of that. Nigel grinned. Still emotionally constipated then? Shut up. Julie approached carefully, tears streaming down her face. Nigel immediately hugged her too. You look after him, Nigel whispered jokingly. Julie laughed. That's impossible. Phil rolled his eyes. I'm standing right here. Nigel turned serious again. You know, despite everything, this place gave me memories I'll never forget. He looked around one last time, the market, the cafe, the Vic, the gardens. Walford. Messy. Loud. Chaotic. Home. The taxi driver leaned out. You ready, mate? Nigel hesitated. Phil suddenly spoke again. You better come back sometime. Nigel smiled warmly. You asking me? No. Just saying. That's basically begging in Phil Mitchell language. Phil smirked despite himself. As Nigel climbed into the taxi, the residents gathered outside watched quietly. Even the toughest faces looked emotional. The car engine started. Nigel rolled down the window one final time. See ya, Walford. Julie waved through tears. Phil gave a small nod, unable to trust himself speaking again. The taxi slowly pulled away from Albert Square. And as it disappeared around the corner, Phil stood motionless in the middle of the square, staring after his old friend. Julie stepped beside him gently. You all right? Phil took a long breath. Then, with rare honesty, he quietly admitted, no. And for once there was nothing else to say. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to EastEnders Spoilers Official.